I'm honored to be joined again by Dr. William von Hippel, social psychologist and author of The Social Leap, which we talked about a few years ago, and most recently, his new book, The Social Paradox, which we'll be talking about today. Bill, welcome back to the Nature and Nurture podcast.
Thanks, Adam. Great to see you again.
Yeah, it's great to catch up after years more learning about psychology, both through the podcast and now, as we talked about, through my PhD program. So it's kind of exciting because we get to upgrade this to graduate seminar level discussion.
Yeah, that is great.
What motivated you to write this new book, The Social Paradox?
So, it was actually a visit to a friend. I had been, I'd been friends with this person forever since we were little kids, and he had gone on to make $1 gazillion all on his own. Like, he didn't start life rich. And so he invited me over for lunch, and we'd gotten together many times, but I'd never been to his place. And so I go to his place, and I'm super curious to see how somebody in the top, 10th of a % lives. And it didn't disappoint. This magnificent home, the maid's off cleaning here, and the cook is deciding on dinner there. And as I'm walking through this house, I'm like, Steve, man, your life is over the top. And he says, without missing a beat, yeah, I know it seems that way, but actually it's really not. And then he starts telling me all the problems that he nonetheless has despite being uber wealthy. And I remember feeling a little bit superior to him. I was like, oh, if I were that wealthy, I would appreciate this. This should, you are psychologically lacking that you can't see this wonderful thing that you have. And I wouldn't be in that situation. And then, so here I am kind of surprised and self-congratulatory that he can't appreciate his own good fortune. And then a few years later, I'm reading Frank Marlowe's wonderful book on the Hadza. And I'm reading about these hunter-gatherers who, they bury almost half their children before they get to adulthood. They have no security for tomorrow. Everything they own, they have to be able to carry on their backs because they're nomadic. They move along every few months. So they own very little. They're exposed to the elements. And they're very happy people. And I remember thinking, holy crap, I'm just like Steve. Like, I'm a multimillionaire compared to them. I had so many of life's conveniences, but I'm not any happier than they are at all. And the more I looked into it, I realized the data suggests they're probably happier than we are. And so I wasn't appreciating my good fortune any more than he was. None of us are. And that really struck me as quite a remarkable fact. And that's what I decided I want to try to figure out in what I wrote about in the book.
Right. Yeah, this huge paradox where we see as prosperity is basically better than ever in the West, you're simultaneously seeing this dramatic mental health crisis. Even before COVID, we were seeing the rise of that.
Yeah. And so part of it is sort of mental health problems, particularly among the younger generations. And part of it is just across the board, people on average are not any happier than our ancestors were, even though our lives are absolutely so much better in every material and comfort and health and safety and even entertainment kind of way that you could imagine.
What about eudaimonic happiness, like this meaning, this transcendent life satisfaction? Has that been declining?
Yeah. That's a great question. I don't know. If we look across time, where we've collected good data, we don't see any decline in life satisfaction, but we don't see any improvement in it either. So for example, the Easterland paradox is basically this idea that as countries, America, we've got good data, West Europe, we've got good data. As they become wealthier in real terms, like Americans are 3 to 4 times wealthier now than they were back in the 1940s when we first started collecting these data. As they become wealthier, they become no happier at all. Life satisfaction hasn't moved an iota. And so it's not now on top of that, we've got good evidence that some things are actually getting worse, but it's not even that things necessarily need to get worse. They simply don't get better, which is remarkable in and of itself. And even they don't get better in short terms. Like, people can remember, I was born in the 1960s. America was a much more dangerous place then. There were no car seats. I fell out of a car once in a carpool driven by a police officer because the door swung open and I rolled out the door. I'm 4 years old. And when they brought me home, the police officer driving the thing said, "I'm really sorry, Billy fell out of the car." And my mother was like, "Oh, he looked fine. Don't worry about it." It was not a big deal. And so obviously no one wants their kids.
That would be a lawsuit nowadays.
Oh, of course it wouldn't be. You're being just blown away, right? And the list goes on. A good friend of mine fell out of the car and when he was being driven in a carpool and his mother said, "Hold on tighter next time." That it was just a different world, and not a better world. It was a worse world. It was dangerous. It was homophobic. It was racist. It was sexist. I mean, the list goes on. And yet we're not happier than we were in the 1960s. If anything, the needle's often gone the other way. And I find that remarkable.
It's nice that you're reminding us of those downsides because often, especially in my generation, you hear this on economic issues. People are talking so nostalgically about the era in which you were growing up, where, you could much more easily buy a house and all those things are true, but neglecting all the ways that it was worse.
Yeah. If you wanted to make a phone call, even interstate, it was expensive. It was so expensive that you rarely did it. When I went to college in the 1980s, I'm now thousands of miles from home. I arranged to talk to my parents only once or twice a week or once every week or two because it just cost so much money to make a phone call. And you couldn't see them. The connection was terrible. You what? I'm sorry. Sorry, I got static. You said that again. And here you and I are talking from many thousands of miles apart. I can see you. It's all happening in real time and it's completely free. Now, yes, a house costs a lot more than it did then, but everything else about our life has become so much easier, cheaper, and more convenient that we don't realize how much richer we are than we used to be.
Wow. Well, do we need that type of challenge in order to actually feel
Mhm.
happy?
Yeah, that's a good question. Um, I think that look, we didn't evolve in a world of safety. And so I do think that coming back to your earlier point about all this anxiety and stuff like that, I do think that you can think about mental health as a little bit like your immune system. And, when we know in today's world, when you're too clean, if you're using anti-vax and all this kind of stuff, that people are more likely to develop autoimmune disorders because their immune system has nothing to fight. It's been honed for millions of years to look out for bad guys. And so it accidentally starts making mistakes and identifying internal things as bad guys because there's not enough real bad guys for it to fight. And I think it's possible that our psychology works similarly, that when we live in a world that's incredibly safe, which is great, it doesn't match it. It's an evolutionary mismatch. Our evolved psychology is looking for real dangers. And when there aren't any real dangers, it turns down the volume. Well, it turns up the volume of what's looking for. It lowers the threshold. And so it starts asking questions like, all right, well, did someone hurt my feelings? Hurting your feelings was no big deal. When I was a little kid, we had this little rhyme we were taught: sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me.
Hmm.
Now,
Yeah.
we know psychologically that that's not really true. We've evolved to be sensitive to what people think about us. But the point was, we were worried about people throwing rocks at us and hitting us with sticks. We weren't worried about feelings. And so
Yeah.
now when people say words are violence, this Chris Rock has this break quote, well, if you think words are violence, you've obviously never been punched in the face. And
Right.
it's great that you've never been punched in the face. And nobody wants to be punched in the face. I'm not advocating for that. But the downside is I do believe that we start getting more anxious when things aren't actually physically going wrong and we have nothing that we really need to worry about.
Hmm.
At least it's a
Yeah.
real possibility.
Yeah. A lot of attention is paid to this kind of hedonic treadmill thing where you just habituate to whatever the new and better thing is. So you're kind of ungrateful, like with lottery winners. We talked a lot about that years ago on the last podcast, but a lot less attention is paid to this negative habituation where it lowers the threshold for. It makes sense if we've evolved a certain level of neuroticism and we're looking for threats, and
Yeah.
strangely there aren't any.
Yeah.
Well, you could be living in bliss all the time, but I guess it makes more sense to just keep that hypervigilance in the safe environment.
It's possible. We don't know, of course. It's very difficult to know if that's what the underlying cause is, but it strikes me as very feasible. And so, for example, we know that children who grow up with pets actually have more robust immune profiles or get tickler seizures or something along that line. I can't remember what the dependent variable was, but basically, if you've got a dog or a cat and you're constantly you can't stay as clean. And so kids who grow up on farms, you can't stay as clean. And that allows you to have your immune system has something to fight, and so it doesn't turn on you. It's possible that what we need is some low-level challenges. And so if that's true, it'd be great to have your kid do a karate class where somebody's beating you up softly, right? You're not physically actually going to get hurt in any meaningful way, but where you're worried about what you're doing and you've got confrontations that are all in a very controlled kind of setting. Maybe. maybe these are the kinds of things that would make the kind of anxiety that we see in our overly safe world less prevalent.
Yeah, I'm not a real germaphobe, but I have developed more anxiety around it in the last few years. And I've wondered, is this just a spillover of more general stress or anxiety, maybe related to being a grad student or anything else? But then I see kids like rolling around, licking the floor,
I
and
said,
and
no,
I'm thinking,
no.
like, I just immediately get this. It's not even disgust response in a judgmental way. It's more like if I were to imagine myself doing that, immediately this anxiety kicks in of I would get myself sick. And then I think, well, A, the kids aren't getting sick. If anything, they're probably going to be more resilient immune wise. I mean, I probably did it when I was that age too, so I built
You
it up.
assured you
But
did.
I don't think I test my immune system as much as I did as a kid.
Yeah. And you probably should. And so one way to solve that problem is you do get a dog or something like that, because it's going to lick you on the
Uh,
face.
well,
It
I do have a
transfer
dog
germs to
actually.
you.
It's helped with that
Okay, good.
because now I
Yeah.
have to uh like grab another dog's poop out of her mouth when she's eating it from the
Exactly.
street. And then
Exactly. Exactly. You force yourself to encounter many more germs that way. And so, I've got a little one right now, and she just eats and picks up and finds the most disgusting things. And I of course try to prevent it when I can, but you can't stop that 24/7, right? And I have the same attitude you have. Well, that's probably good for her. That's going to help develop a more robust immune system. And I remember once I have an adult daughter who we were in the movie theater together, and she used to have a pacifier, and it fell out of her mouth into this pile of Lord even knows what it was on the theater floor. And she wanted it back. And I was afraid to give it to her with all that disgustingness on it. So I thought, well, my immune system's bigger. So I picked it up and sucked it clean and then handed it to her. Annoyingly, she had now fallen asleep and didn't want it anymore. But
you suck for
it's
nothing.
the great thing about being a parent or a dog owner or whatever is you'd never be grabbing dog poop in any other aspect of your life, but now you've forced yourself into that caregiving role. And so you re-encounter these disgusting things.
Hmm. Yeah, I heard about that during COVID, where everyone was being hyper sanitary, and that it could have been either collectively weakening our immune system or even allowing the germs themselves to get stronger, because it's not like the sanitizer will kill all of it, 99.9%.
Yeah.
That 0.1% is going to be more resilient and multiply. We hear about this with the antibiotic crisis as well.
Yep. Yep. Not to mention that the 0.1% when it comes to germs is a lot of germs.
Right, right.
They're in large numbers.
Do you think that, I've heard theories about during COVID how the isolation also led to this.
Sorry
Well,
about
the
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 cockatoos.
protests are a good example. Are just like this collective suppressing whatever negative was going on in the background. That it's like it's a tank that filled up, and then that spills over into culture and makes, political polarization worse, or whatever the other problem is, like downstream side effects.
That's possible. I do think that we've evolved to handle illness by circling the wagon. Particularly if you didn't live in the most extreme latitudes, the closer to the poles, you were exposed to germs that people across the river or down the valley may not be exposed to, and vice versa. And so pandemics bring out the worst in us because we probably most effectively handle those threats by rejecting outsiders and becoming more xenophobic. And there's pretty good data from people like Randy Thornhill and their colleagues that the more exposed to pathogens you are, the more xenophobic you tend to be. And so we tend to think about tribal being like, let's say if you're in the United States, being Americans versus not, but Americans are also very tribal within the US of my region, my politics, my religion, et cetera. And I think that the pandemic made all of that worse because it
Mhm.
latched onto this evolved mechanism of circling the wagons, increased xenophobia in the presence of illness.
Uh-huh. So this parasite stress theory. The
Yeah.
interesting thing is it's almost like the predictions were flipped, because it would say that conservatives are the ones that are going to be more disgust sensitive and freaking out about the virus more. But if anything, the conservatives were the ones protesting mask use and wanting to let the virus go free.
Yeah. I actually find those data about conservatives versus liberals a little bit less compelling. That's more on the margins, the edges of the effect. These effects are species typical. And so humans do X. It's much more true than conservatives do it more than liberals, or liberals do it more than conservatives, because all of us evolved in the same kind of climate. Now, there's reasons to be conservative versus liberal, and some of those might even have to do with pathogens, but most of them have to do with other factors. So empathy, for example, is a very strong predictor of your political orientation. And empathy is completely separate from pathogen sensitivity. And your empathy, our empathy and our morality evolved as an in-group mechanism. It did not evolve for feeling kindly towards somebody who isn't a member of another group. We would have happily exterminated them in our past. And so we now are living this blessed world where you can feel empathic to somebody who you've never met from a country you've never even heard of when you see them in the news and something bad happens to them. But that wasn't our ancestral past. And so I think that these pathogen theories of our psychology, I think they're really robust. I think that they start to account for a lot less variance when you try to then apply them differentially within humans as a function of other kinds of aspects of ourselves, like our politics.
Have you followed any of Jordan Peterson's arguments connecting the evolutionary psychology of memes from Richard Dawkins with this Jungian idea of archetypes? And he's basically saying that we co-evolved certain ideas, and this could be one of them that we're talking about, like the positives or negatives associated with allowing outgroup members into our tribe. Have you followed
I'm
that?
afraid I'm very ignorant about his arguments. I should know much more about it, but I've let all that go, unfortunately, because I've been too busy elsewhere. But I would say that, um, you know, it is, I agree at the broad level that outgroups, we've evolved to be positive toward our in-groups. We've evolved to have a strong connection to them, to cooperate with them, to do all that. And outgroups, we haven't evolved to dislike, but we haven't evolved to like them either. We've evolved to be very um, ambivalent about them, to be very ready to identify them as threat, but also ready to identify them as opportunity. Because in our ancestral past, they were both. Sometimes they were a great chance to increase the gene pool, have flow of individuals between groups, and sometimes they wanted to exterminate all of you. And so you need to be able to be sensitive to opportunity because that's important, but you also need to be sensitive to threat.
What do you think about this more general idea of mimetic evolution? Like, does it make sense to think about memes or ideas having a life of their own, a natural selection process of their own? Gad Saad talks about it in The Parasitic Mind as though ideas can actually parasitize a host and a human, socially intelligent host.
I would say yes and no. I strongly believe that we've evolved to use culture, that we're cultural animals, that's what makes us a success. And there's many features about humanity that, the simplest way of putting it is, how successful would you be if I dropped you naked and alone in the jungle of anywhere? You'd probably end up being somebody's dinner within a few days. How successful would you be if I dropped 100 of you naked and no longer alone anywhere? You'd be the new apex predator in that part of the forest. And we've evolved to work together. We're smart, we're capable, we can do amazing things, but the group mind is way more than some of the individuals. And so ideas are super important. We've evolved to use culture to benefit from culture. And that does mean that ideas can take hold that may or may not actually be of any survival or reproductive value to you, because we're so sensitive to them. They're so available to us. That's what's made us a success. I don't, with that said, I think it's kind of unfortunate that we use the term evolution when we talk about cultural evolution, because it's not quite the same process. The mindless evolution that's genetic, that's really all about survival and reproduction, is not quite the same as you telling me an idea and I go, that's kind of cool. I think I'm going to do that too. Or the leader of our group saying, now we all do X, and X we do, right? And then it just becomes a habit and we don't even know why we did it anymore. Um, so, there's a variety of processes that bring that about. Like over imitation is a really good example, where we don't need to understand all the rules, but if I follow your rituals, and if 7 of those steps are important and valuable and help detoxify the food or whatever, then I can safely eat it too, even if I don't understand them. Consequent then being, yes, our mind is very open to being parasitized by rituals that are actually bad things. But with that said, you don't need to believe that there's evolution of memes. You don't need to believe in You just believe that they have their own cultural pathways and their own persuasive pathways that are quite separate.
Hmm. That's another kind of social paradox because a lot of these evolved cultural norms, like I'm thinking again about behavioral immune system and religious traditions, like there's often these strict norms surrounding food and sex, which are the things most directly related to pathogens. That you could say that they're overkill or it causes these indirect harms, but then also in a different way, there might be some benefit to it. And I'm even thinking again about this mental health crisis where strangely for people with more conservative attitudes and religious communities, like I've seen some data that it's not just being religious per se, but the involvement in a religious community and having that weekly get together and having that close network and maybe even just this belief system in a transcendent meaning as opposed to nihilistic beliefs that could impact one's mental health, even though we can also look at a lot of harm that has happened from religion.
So, first of all, I totally agree with you. Religion has all sorts of excellent side effects, one of which is just happiness. We know that people who pray regularly are happier than people who don't. We know that the social side of it's huge. People who go to services, that effect is even bigger than prayer. Um, and yet I think people go to services not because they think it'll make them happy, but because they think God wants them to. And then they get this lovely side effect of being happy nonetheless. So it's really a nice experiment about the value of sociality. Religion also has a um, a link to society in the exact way that you talk about, whereby if um, you know if your religion benefits your society, well then if you have food hygiene habits that are good for you, well then it's like a culturally valuable bit of knowledge because everybody will prescribe to it, and then they'll do something that's actually healthier. But of course, those things can also change with time. And so what's good for you today in today's world and might benefit your society might be bad for you down the road. And so there's a lovely example that these cultural practices in Rob Brooks' first book, I think it's called Sex, Genes, and Rock and Roll or something like that, where if you look at patrilocal versus matrilocal societies, so people who move to when they marry, they move in with the male or they move in with the female family. Um, in matrilocal societies, they tended to do really well in hoe-based and early hoe-based agriculture because that was something where women tended to do it, and they were therefore in the communities that are cooperative. But once you switch to plow-based agriculture, now men tend to do that because the work is very heavy, and so you want male cooperation. And so patrilocal societies tended to do better. And so these cultural traditions, which are probably largely random, may be responsive to local ecology, but then the local ecology changes and they may or may not end up being good for you. And religion's a great example. Probably lots of aspects of religion have enhanced health, and probably lots of aspects of it have detracted from it. And it simply depended on the time and place, whether you got lucky and your religion benefited you or you didn't. But of course, if it's good enough or bad enough, it can make groups ascendant, right? Religion or any cultural idea can do that.
Mhm. I've heard similar arguments with the different farming practices, like for wheat versus for rice, trying to explain some of the Eastern-Western collectivism
Mhm.
difference. Does that hold up?
Yeah, absolutely. So Thomas Tallam has done a lot of that really nice work where you look, for example, within China, the northern regions are more wheat, the southern regions are more rice. Rice relies on irrigation going across. It's heavily irrigation dependent because it takes so much water. And so your farm is next to mine. I have to make sure you maintain your irrigation channels or mine won't grow. Whereas wheat doesn't, you could do what you want. I depend on the rain that I get. Maybe I'm irrigating a little bit by bringing it in from the local river or whatever, but it's not nearly as water dependent. And so, and same with a couple key points of harvest. And so the local ecological conditions, and that's the kind of farming in this case, can then cause the people to become more collectivist, more interdependent, or more individualist because they don't need each other as much. And the one thing we do know is that when people don't need each other as much, they reliably shift toward individualism. The whole world is doing that. Wealth, for example, increases individualism. Technology increases individualism. All the things that make us not need each other as much, we shift away from collectivist cultures because they tend to be so demanding.
Do you think that's related to the declining birth rates?
I think it is. I think they're reciprocally related. And so as birth rates decline, um, then parents have more time spent their energies on fewer kids and they can cater to them more. And so the more I cater to you, the more you start to think, well, my individual autonomy needs are paramount because they're constantly being met. And I'm not emphasizing your responsibilities. And I'm not saying you need to share that with your brother because you don't have a brother. And I've got my parents are catering to you too because you may be their only grandchild. And so suddenly the world revolves around you, which is a very individualistic orientation, rather than you have roles and responsibilities, which is a very collectivist one.
I've been gravitating towards psychoanalysis recently. This is just one of my fringe tangent grad school interests,
Uh-huh.
and it's just as controversial or outlierish, but it's kind of innocuous because, it's not controversial for any
Mhm.
political reasons. It's just people don't really take it
Yep.
seriously. But what I've been
Yep.
trying to do, not in any research way, just in my head, is reformatting those psychoanalytical dictums in modern cognitive, computational, statistical learning sense, because it makes a lot of sense to me that these early childhood experiences are going to have a disproportionate effect on your lifelong attitude. If you think of it in a Bayesian framework, like that's just years of early input with the heightened neuroplasticity. So it's going to have disproportionate weight. And then if you also combine that like with the Piaget's idea of cognitive scaffolding, it's hard to prove. It's kind of an elegant theory, but it makes a lot of sense to me that even if they weren't framing it in such a scientific way, I've started to think a lot about these early developmental influences and even just socially, like something like what we're talking about, which intuitively makes a lot of sense that from an early age, if you're an only child, if you're getting a lot of attention, you're just gonna develop this kind of cognitive scaffolding that's like a light version of egocentrism. And even if it's only a small change between, say, an only child and someone with siblings, at a population level, it makes sense to me that you're going to see these massive cultural shifts over time.
Yeah, I agree with you. I too resonate with psychoanalytic theory because it's so fun and interesting. Coincidentally, both of my maternal grandparents were students of Freud. And so they were back in
Wow.
Vienna analyzing people way back in the 20s, right? And so it has this family connection to it. It has they're interesting and intellectually very rich. But I also, Trivers hit the nail on the head when he talks about Freud's big mistake. And a key example is, originally when people started coming to him and saying that they were being sexually abused, when these women in his practice said they're being sexually abused by parents or uncles, he believed them. But then it just happened so frequently, he thought, well, they come from such good homes, well-to-do backgrounds. This can't, it's this sort of classist assumption of his. This can't really be true. And so if it's not true, why are they telling me it? Well, maybe they want it to be true. And from there comes all this Oedipal theory and all this nonsense. And that's it's very evolutionarily uninformed. And so I think that um, all these old psychoanalytic theories are fun. They resonate with me. They're certainly interesting at the thing. But they have the two flaws. One, they're super hard to test, and two, they're sometimes completely misguided. But like everything else, we can throw away what we know is now wrong, and we can try to embrace the things that we know are right, and we can turn them into new terms, and we can think about how they might be testable. So, yeah, I'm completely on the same page with you, and I think your sort of Bayesian approach to it is a great one.
I started teaching for the first time this year. I'm a teaching assistant for Steve's intro psych class. And one of the early lectures was on Freud. Now, this is kind of the standard intro psych historical approach. Like you talk about it, but dismiss or critique the unscientific parts of it, and then you build on where his psychology built. So, you go to behaviorism and then more modern research that's kind of segregated by area. And in the discussion section that I was leading, we were talking about a lot of the Freudian theories. And one of them was his anal retentive theory. So that children who learn toilet training earlier, uh, if they learn it too early, then they're too stubborn and controlling. So, like your anal is a personality trait, or they're anal expulsive. So, his theory was you learn toilet training too late. And then as a result of that, you're a mess later in life in general. So, that was one of many not very scientific sounding theories we talked about. And I asked the students in my discussion, which of his theories were scientific, like could be tested, and which were inherently unfalsifiable. And at the beginning, people said that that anal theory also sounded unscientific. And I thought, at least in the sense of could this be tested, this was one of the most scientific. You could actually imagine just cohort studies. And then the other funny thing was initially students were saying, okay, but that would be way too difficult and unethical because you'd have to randomly assign kids to different potty training groups. And then I was saying, no, you could just imagine asking people, and sure, there'd be some measurement errors. Parents might report wrong, but it's not that different from looking at the effects of breastfeeding. So the interesting thing is it's basically the exact same study design. You've heard about these studies on breastfeeding and IQ. So it seemed just as scientific to me. Obviously, I don't think it would hold up the anal retentive, anal expulsive. And then that got me thinking about the breastfeeding and IQ finding. Because people talk about in these developmental psych classes, breastfeeding is associated with higher IQ relative to formula feeding. And I thought that's the biggest marketing scam of all time because it frames it as though formula is the norm and breastfeeding boosts your IQ. And another way to read that is breastfeeding is the norm and formula actually decreases your IQ. And when I thought about that, students agreed that was such a scary flip that generations of people have been giving this. I mean, it works, but decreased IQ, that's a pretty massive side effect.
Yeah. So to start with both great questions. To start with the anal theory, the downside of it is that Freud was also a little bit slippery is not the right word because he was just trying to tell what he regarded as the truth. He wasn't trying to be unfalsifiable, and so he also said that you could also form a reaction formation against this personality that you had and do the opposite. And so early and harsh toilet training could lead you to be anal and be super neat your whole life, or could lead you to be a slob as anal expulsive as you do the opposite. And same with late toilet training. So the problem was that whatever you ended up at, that was because of that, but you took two different routes. Now that could be completely right. For all we know, Freud's exactly right that this early and harsh toilet training has a massive effect on your personality, but because it could go in either direction or some combination of the above, we can't really test that scientifically. The breastfeeding and IQ, of course, it turns out that probably breast milk, there's a lot of genetic effects in who's breastfeeding and wealthy parents and things like that can create a false IQ link that probably isn't there. Breast milk does have some clear nutritive benefit. And then the question just becomes, and it has some clear immune benefits. Do you gain those nutritive and immune benefits anyway? Or are you in an environment where if you're not breastfed, you don't have the wherewithal to gain those benefits in other ways? And the not too much exposure to pathogens, etc. And so in the end, I can't remember the exact data, but I'd put money that breast milk doesn't raise your IQ more than 1/100th of 1 point. But what it really does is it ensures a really well-fed, positive, nutritive environment that if you can replicate, then really the only end result is going to be the breast milk does give you lots of great immune functioning that you're carrying straight from your mother. And so those kind of natural, and it's very easy to digest. It has all those positives that'll just make you, make it easier to be an infant. But, mothers who can't breastfeed aren't relegating their child to a life of stupidity because the IQ benefits are probably functionally zero.
Right. So it was confounded by SES is what you're saying.
By SES and genetics that, the people who are, so especially nowadays, the messages are so clear. Everybody knows that they should breastfeed, but there's still differences in how capable you are of doing it by how well taken care of you are yourself. And so the wealthier you are, the more body fat you're going to have, the easier it's going to be to breastfeed. Well, that's actually not even true anymore. We now have lower SES people often have higher body fat because they're eating lower protein diets. But anyway, my point is just that those two things end up being completely confounded. And so it's very hard to separate out the SES environment, the genetic environment, and the impact of breastfeeding itself. Because as you were saying earlier, we don't do experiments in that anymore. Nobody randomly assigns to breastfeed anymore. So we know very little about what you actually should do and how long you should actually do it.
That reminds me of these other studies, and I guess it's changed the medical practice now, where for the same reason, like just through the immune benefits that you get through natural birth that C-section babies were missing out on. Uh, there's probably a more precise medical way, but they essentially take some of the germs and put it on the baby just so that it doesn't miss out on those immune benefits.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because we evolved to be born a certain way. There's clear negatives to being born that way. It looks and is unpleasant as heck for the mother. It can't be nice for the infant. They often go into distress. But we evolved to benefit from that in a variety of different ways. And so once we remove that, we want to say, all right, well, what are the benefits? What are the costs and benefits of our interventions, and how can we restore some of those benefits? We don't need to take the kid to a ringer and squeeze them for 24 hours, but we might want to expose them to germs in the same exact way you say.
But that was another one of these psychoanalytic theories, wasn't it? Before knowing about brain development, just thinking that birth trauma was what gave us the amnesia from those earliest ages.
Yeah, yeah. It's a funny, interesting idea, and it's not a bad one. It just turns out to be, that our intellectual capabilities and our attention span is so limited at birth that of course we have amnesia. We can't remember anything or very little before we had words to describe it. But I remember when I was in college, Sandra Scar, who's this wonderful developmental psychologist, with my advisor, and she was telling us about how it seems like it's really important that mothers get skin contact with their babies right when they're born. And maybe that's part of the reason why adoptive mothers often don't bond as well with their children, because they didn't get the skin contact. At the time, they didn't know about oxytocin, and that skin contact caused a release of oxytocin, which was this bonding chemical. They didn't know that it was released when you breastfeed. And so breastfeeding at the very beginning is important. But they nonetheless were kind of finding something that sort of mattered, which was latching onto it. Now, it turned out the studies weren't well done, because they would ask women, do you want to have skin contact with your baby when it's first born, or should we clean it up and get ready for you? And the mothers who were more keen to be mothers were like, yeah, give me that gooey, disgusting thing. And the mothers who were a little less keen were like, oh, clean that up before you hand it off. And of course, that was highly predictive of bonding, right? And so we were taught those studies more as a context of how flawed they were. But it turns out later on that they were actually based on some very sound neurochemicals and hormonal changes that we just didn't know about.
Mm-hmm. I've been on the fence about what to think about attachment theory, because on one hand, and I'm talking about the earliest forms, so like not just saying that your relationship with your parents throughout childhood is going to matter, but attachment in the sense that if when you're an infant, they didn't attend to your crying quickly enough and you didn't learn that sort of secure base, those types of early psychoanalytic theories. On one hand, I think sort of in an evolutionary developmental way, it doesn't make much sense for you to retain any real sorts of long-term memory or scaffolding based on before you were autonomous. On the other hand, I think, well, a lot of is happening neurodevelopmentally during those first few years. So it makes sense that there could be some scaffolding, and especially if we factor in oxytocin, maybe that has something to do with it. On the other hand, I think those are basically personality trait differences in like agreeableness and neuroticism. So that could be entirely confounded by behavioral genetics. I don't know what to make of it.
Yeah. So look, I think the behavioral genetics route is always strong and really hard to avoid. And most of the literature doesn't even try, because you've got these early childhood experiences and they mediate attachment effects. Are they mediating it because the kind of parents who were neglectful are going to raise kids who are going to be insecurely attached genetically? But there's nothing to do with that. They could have been adopted away and they would still be that way. Or are they powerful because the behaviors themselves actually mattered? And almost all the research that we did for a very long time was hopelessly confounded. There's nothing we could do about it. With that said, I also resonate to what you said earlier, that there's this Bayesian process. And if my Bayesian thing is, well, when I cry, my needs are rarely met, means, okay, I've got to look out for myself. I can't count on relationship partners. That's not an unreasonable thing for a child to learn, right? And so you can easily see that what we would call insecure attachment or anxious attachment is really just this Bayesian relationship partners are neglectful. They can't be counted on. They don't necessarily answer you versus, oh, when I cried, I was always taken care of. Things always worked out okay. I know that my partner, that whoever takes care of me may be flawed. They may not have given me exactly what I wanted, but they were attentive, right? Because I didn't speak English. So they didn't know that I had a dirty nappy and they tried to give me a bottle. Kids must get frustrated. Well, they do get very frustrated at that. And so I don't see why we couldn't have a much simpler Bayesian version, which is you learn relationships between can versus not, which by the way, you can very much unlearn, right? You have great parents and a terrible partner and you realize, oh, things not everything works that way or vice versa. But of course, you made a great point earlier. Those early experiences are laid down on top of nothing. You're highly neuroplastic. And so they could have a much bigger impact than later life experience.
Mhm. You might be familiar with some of these experimental studies, oxytocin knockout studies in rodents that have been done very recently since we got CRISPR gene editing. And you see the same effect where, let's say you have an oxytocin knockout mother. So she's going to produce less milk and even just psychologically have less of that impulse for care. And then the rodent pups, well, they're not getting as quality nursing time. So they have, in some cases, higher cortisol levels and impaired brain development. And then that can trigger an epigenetic suite of changes that affect their parenting behavior. And I just look at the whole thing and I think it's kind of very Freudian. It's like, in this case, it's just a physiological switch, but effectively, it's like you just created a rodent refrigerator mother and you got exactly the anxious pup, except you're not using those psychological terms. You're using terms of high cortisol.
Yeah, I would agree with you. And I would say that the one sort of moderator in the mix is that you can have somebody who is genetically very robust and they could have a refrigerator mother or any other wide variety, and they could still come out somehow resilient and happily well connected and secure. And you can have the opposite case. You can have somebody who's genetically a little bit more fragile or more sensitive, whatever you might want to call it. And despite a very attentive parent, they could still come out very nervous and anxious and all that. And so those rodent models are great. And of course, rodents are complicated. And I do think that they map onto humans often, but we do have add a level of complication on top of that. And not just sometimes in ways that are uniquely human because of our enormous cognitive capacity, and sometimes in ways that are more about, well, rodents do the same thing. When we look at averages, you see those effects across experiments. And when you're looking at yourself, you also have your own genetic makeup to consider. I've got friends who, were exposed to the most horrific parenting. And when you ask about their childhood, they just smile like, oh, it was so nice. I was running around freely in the forest. And I'm like, yeah, because your parents weren't feeding you and you were, but they don't see it that way, right? And so it's quite remarkable how much variability there is in this domain.
Mm-hmm. So I do mostly developmental work, and there's still this strong prior or ethos of blank slateism, like social constructivism. That's what got me interested in this whole nature versus nurture debate for a lot of these questions. And it makes sense to me. So the optimistic version is, well, when you're talking about something like mental health or IQ, it's nice to have the sort of blank slatist view because it comes with the spin of, every child has potential and any setback can also be overcome. So I really like that. But then there's this more cynical side of me that thinks it's also like if you genuinely believe that, then there's people are sort of patting themselves on the back for their own success. And I'm thinking of PhD developmental psychologists that have made a career on this type of argument versus the behavior geneticist I meet. It kind of forces you into this humility of whatever intelligence or conscientiousness or stable mental health that you have, you didn't even earn it. The extreme would be Sapolsky, no free will. You're just the recipient of a genetic lottery, or you lose on this genetic roll of the dice. I That's also something that I'm still wrestling with ethically, trying to figure out where I stand there.
Yeah. And I would say that there's two ways of thinking about this problem. The first is I'm in complete agreement with you. And so, for example, if you look at the Dunedin studies where they've been following these kids who were born in Dunedin, I can't remember now, I think it was the early 80s, but whatever set of years it was, they've been following them ever since. And one of the interesting findings is that if you do a polygenic score on their school attainment, you can predict whether they rise above their social class or fall out of it by virtue of whether their polygenic score is higher than the average for the social class they're born in, or lower than the average, or equal to the average. And so you admire somebody who was born poor and raises themselves up by their bootstraps, but these days they say, no, you're just admiring their genes. They had got lucky that they got a good set of genes that allowed them to go to school, do well in school, and then attain something that their parents couldn't. So yeah, on that side, it's you and I are completely on the same page. But on the other side, the one thing that I think that we all tend to forget because of the world we happen to live in now is that there's many, many ways to be this wonderful, valuable human. And the unfortunate truth about our current world is that the easiest, most direct route is educational attainment. But there's no magic to that. And our ancestors always were trying to find a way that they could contribute. And the same holds for us today. Just because education may not be your thing doesn't mean there aren't lots of other great ways that you can contribute. And so you might have lost one genetic lottery, but you may have won another. You may be a kinder person or a more helpful person or a person who's got artistic skills, or, the list goes on. There's a billion ways you can contribute. And that's, I think, from my perspective, that's one of the key reasons why we developed a sense of autonomy in the first place, why evolution of our feelings of autonomy are so important, because we need to find our own best prospects. We need to decide where's the domain, the avenue whereby I can make the best contribution, that I'll be the most interested in pursuing it, that I can dedicate myself to the most, so that I can be as valuable as possible. And it's super easy to get hung up on when we think about the genetic lottery. We're always talking about smart, but smart is one of many, many variables, and it's not even the most important one in predicting whether you're a success in life.
That reminds me of one of Rob Henderson's arguments. He's saying that people often lie and flatten the standard, like say everyone is smart, everyone is beautiful, and that he's arguing it's actually a tell for what the person values, as opposed to saying, well, there's differences in this, but that
Yeah.
doesn't diminish your worth as a human being at all.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Rob is a super smart guy. So it's ironic that he's pointing that out in this particular context. But I completely agree. And there's this wonderful comedian who makes the same point about beauty. They're telling girls everyone's beautiful, and then she's like, they're just not. She goes, you want to say, sweetie, with that face, you better study math. And so she's just kind of kidding around about the fact that when you say everyone's beautiful, everyone's smart, what you're really saying is these are super important things, and I can't admit the fact that there's variability on that domain. But there's variability on every domain. And we can be, an important, valuable, meaningful contributor in countless different ways. And brains and beauty are not the only two that matter. They're not even the two most important. When you ask people what they're looking for more in life than anything else, they want kindness. And we never, have you ever heard anyone say everyone's kind? We know full well, not everyone's kind, right? It's just a fact. And so the ways that we can contribute are almost limitless, but the things that we value because they're so easily identified and they matter so much in our culture, brains and beauty, are really, as a human, not even the two most things that you put at the top of the list.
This is another way that I've come to appreciate the religious perspective, kind of reluctantly out of pragmatism, because when I think of, what makes human life valuable, if you're thinking pragmatically, even in terms of, kind of utilitarian, how much are you contributing, it very rapidly turns eugenicist. And, there was a time where all the best scientists were thinking along those lines, and it was a disaster. And now I think, even though it seems almost so obviously not true, because it's hard to justify intellectually, should someone who's like bedridden and draining resources on society be valuable, just as valuable as like the person who cured cancer? And yet any other thought system seems to just very rapidly deteriorate into where do you draw the line, and who gets the power to draw the line, as opposed to just practically you say no one gets to draw the line.
Yeah. So, it's an unfortunate truth about all life, is that the harder life is, the more focused you become on, are you bringing in more calories than you're consuming? And if not, you're just not valuable to our group and we can't sustain you anymore. And this thing happened for our hunter-gatherer ancestors many, many times. And there was often a person in the tribe who had the role of whacking you in the back of the head when you were no longer contributing as much as you were costing. And so it made you nervous to be out walking with that guy thinking, I wonder if he thinks that I'm no longer a net plus. But what it also did is it became an intrinsic part of our psychology whereby we always want to contribute. And so we contribute in different ways at different stages in our life. You contribute when you're young by usually working hard and making money and doing those things. You contribute when you're older by trying to mentor and pass on and teach and things like that. But we all feel this need to contribute that's kind of remarkable because it's so central to our psychology that, for example, people dream their whole lives of retiring. And then when they retire, they're often sad and dismayed because they can't contribute anymore, because they're not doing that which they had done their whole lives. So we live in a world now where we're so blessedly rich that we don't have to do that. But trust me when I say our ancestors looked at you when you were a baby and said, sorry, you don't look healthy enough. You're not going to make it. And you got set down on a rock and they walked away. And this has happened throughout human history. And so it's wildly eugenist to say that some people are better than others, but it's when the chips are down, when there's not enough to eat, people who can't contribute that get left behind. And
Mhm.
we happen to be blessed that we don't have to do that anymore. We're now allowed to say, well, look, you're in a hospital bed. You can't contribute anything, but we can afford to sustain you. And so we will. And so it's nice that that we're no longer forced to make that, what you're calling quite accurate, I think, eugenist decision about who's good enough, who makes cut and who doesn't.
This is another place that I've been split because when I think of the evolutionary psychology perspective, what you're saying there makes complete sense that that's more what is adaptive, and it's not to commit the naturalistic fallacy and say that that's more right. But what it makes me think of is uh, it initiated kind of in this new agey spiritual framing, like when people say we're evolving as a species, we're going through this new moral evolution. But you see a little bit of it even now, just with artificial intelligence, people talking about universal basic income. Are you going to need to contribute, or are we going to live in this utopia of superabundance? I mean, there's plenty of ways that we're far off from that, but at this point, it seems like it's largely more a problem of distribution of resources than like not having enough.
Yeah, I agree. I think that we're not that far from universal basic income. We're not that far from energy being so close to free that it's functionally limitless. We're not that far from AI being able to do almost everything that we don't need to do it ourselves. And so right now, we're defined by our occupations. What do you want to be when you grow up is a question we ask to very young children. It's something that we all think about a lot. We're told when we're young adults or late adolescents, you need to follow your passion, find your dream, make the world a better place, whatever it is you want to do. And that becomes central to our self-definitions. And in this post-work world, suddenly that wouldn't matter for your self-definition at all, right? You don't need to work at all if you don't want to. Now, it's not clear to me how we're going to handle that psychologically, but the one sure piece of good news is that we weren't always this way. Nobody asked a hunter-gatherer child, what do you want to do when you grow up? Because the answer was always the same. Well, I'll do what I can to secure enough calories. I'll gather and hunt, right? That's what we do. And so pre-agriculture and pre-cities, we all did the exact same thing. And it may well be the case that post-universal basic income, post-AI, we also go back to doing the exact same thing, which is a whole lot of nothing. Hanging around, socializing, maybe creating for our own entertainment, doing sport. I don't know. I know that boredom is very bad for humans, that some of our worst behaviors come out in communities where people are really bored, but it's not enough to do, be it addiction or abuse or whatever. But you can easily imagine in this world, boredom won't be an issue because the entertainment and self-expression opportunities are limitless. So I'm kind of bullish about it, even though I won't probably live to see it myself. I'm a little too old. I'm going to miss this one, but I think it's going to be really interesting.
Wow. When I think about that social paradox, one concern, I mean, imagine we're in this universal basic income world. Things get even worse because, as you were talking about at the beginning, as prosperity has risen, mental health has declined or at least not improved. And in some ways, hunter-gatherers would be even happier. I like this alternative optimistic perspective of, well, if you have everything you need, or if you don't have to work at least, you can kind of live a hunter-gatherer lifestyle again. People could form communities and just follow wherever their interest and minimizing boredom takes them.
Yeah. And I think the key would be, and this comes back to what I was writing about in the social paradox, is that we've evolved another form of evolutionary mismatch. And that is that our ancestors needed to connect to survive. And so connection was a guarantee, but they had opportunities for autonomy, but they mostly couldn't take them because if you guys all decided you wanted to go north, I can't just go south because I'll get eaten. And so even though I've got total autonomy to make that decision, safety precludes you from doing it. And now in today's world, we don't physically need each other anymore. And so we keep making the choices to do things that enhance our autonomy, which, as I argue in the book, by necessity diminish your connection. And so in this post-work world, what would actually make people happy is connecting, doing things with each other, strengthening relationships. And whether people have the good sense to do that or will continue to follow what they want, which is autonomy and doing their own thing, and then end up spending their lives unhappy and alone, I don't know, because right now we're moving in the wrong direction. We're moving very much in the autonomy, unhappy alone direction.
It might be a luxury belief, but I've tried to think a lot about this self-actualization, even in just pursuing my more authentic and sometimes obscure or controversial research interests while I have the luxury of all this freedom, as opposed to doing the thing that's safer and more likely to get grants, but feels a little bit like selling your soul to the academic system and in a way that I didn't want to do. So sometimes I'm really building this philosophy around, well, again, like the moral imperative is self-actualization. Other times I really beat myself up about it, thinking, what an extreme luxury belief, because most people, their life does revolve around you have to make this necessary sacrifice and do work that you don't necessarily want to do. And the only way I've been able to find a philosophical out is if we do have this type of universal basic income structure where one day, due to technological progress and prosperity, everyone could have the freedom. But then I sound like this naive idealist college student, and that also kind of backfired.
Well, I guess what I would say is you have to remember that life involves a lot of luck. And that luck manifests in a variety of different ways. I lucked into a job that actually suits me really well. I've always loved what I do. There's any aspect of social science that have been happening as an economist, as a neuroscientist, as a biologist, as an anthropologist. But this is the kind of thing that I do best. And out of pure luck, I decided to do this rather than physics, which is what I thought I wanted to pursue when I was younger. But I had an uncle who kind of talked me out of it, who was a physicist. And I was very relieved that, he told me, he said, look, if I died, I would set the field back by about 3 minutes because we're all just racing to solve the same problem. And I thought, oh, that doesn't sound like fun at all. I'd like wide open spaces where people can't even agree on what the important problems are. And that gives you a lot more scope. So there's luck in whether you happen to find a career that suits you. There's luck in whether you happen to find a partner that suits you, who you can meet your autonomy needs and can meet your connection needs at the same time, who you will enjoy their company every day of your life. Those things, in principle, they're available to all of us, but some of us through bad luck aren't going to find them. And some of us through good luck are. And so if you have the good luck and you find those things you really want to do, and you find the partner who really makes you happy or not, good luck in all these domains is independent of each other. But when you have that good luck, you shouldn't beat yourself up for it. You should say, wow, that was really nice that I landed on something I really want to do. Let's see if I can make a go of it. And if I can't, so be it. Then I'll do something I want to do less. But the fact that I even found it makes me lucky because tons of my students and friends and family never find something that they really love to do, even though assuredly it's out there. Leonardo da Vinci might have been the greatest basketball player who ever lived, but he never played, so we don't know. And so the thing is that there's lots of opportunity for all of us, and we maybe stumble upon it and we maybe don't. And when I look at my own life, with so many random turns and directions, and some were bad, but many were good, and many were foundational. If I hadn't happened to chat with so-and-so then about this, I never would have gone in this wonderful direction that's proved to be so beneficial, or met this person, or whatever the case might be. And so, don't beat yourself up for landing on a good thing. It is lots of the greatest things in life are democratically available, even if we don't all find them.
I like that optimistic perspective. You know, I started off with physics too, and there's a lot about my situation that I would attribute to luck, especially if you go far back enough, like again, just genetic lottery luck or being born in the United States around this time, things like that. But even just starting from college, I had some of the same insight or fear of, well, if I pursue physics and I'm not already a prodigy, uh, am I gonna just is my existence as a physicist going to make more than 3 minutes of a difference? I kind of liked that psychology was more philosophical because you can be fairly opinionated, but it's not as extreme as philosophy, where at the end of the day, there's not data to prove you wrong. So I liked that blend of it. So I can partially look back and say it was luck, and there's plenty of luck. Again, just I think that's mostly being in the right circumstances to go to college in general. But then within college and having that freedom of choice, I think it was a pretty active decision-making process and being picky and figuring out that I was the personality type to like that mix of philosophy and applied social science.
Yeah, um, I would agree with all of that. I think I meander along in much the same way. And the, you know, we live in a world where that matters a lot. That won't be the dimension that matters anymore, in this universal basic income world. Maybe what will matter there is, do you have six hobbies or friends who really sustain you, because work is irrelevant? Now we just don't know the answer to those questions yet, but we do know that that these things are going to change a lot. Um, we also know, for example, that the world's going to peak in population later this century, and then it's going to start going down, maybe forever, maybe until we're all gone, but probably until we're at a much lower number, in a way that's sort of self-sustaining, in a comfortable way that makes people more inclined to have kids. Because right now, in every industrialized country on earth, people don't have enough kids to replace themselves. And so there's so much about the future that's going to change what life looks like, what the economy looks like, what day-to-day life looks like, urban versus rural living. We evolved as rural species. 150 years ago, 90% of us still lived in rural environments where primary production, 90% of us were in abject poverty and couldn't read. I mean, it was a tough place. Now, starting since 2007, more than half of humanity lives in cities. Now, that's just a completely different environment than we evolved in. And those completely different environments all bring in their own opportunities and their own challenges for human happiness, satisfaction, flourishing, etc.
A lot of people in my generation are pretty scared or cynical about having kids, and a lot of it, at least they say, boils down to economics or housing. For the most part, I'm pretty optimistic, partially because of all the technological progress and how cheap food and energy are, like we talked about, but even because of this demographic reason, because I think, well, whatever the economic situation is for me at a household level, when I think of those kids entering into a world where there's really not as much of a workforce, they're going to be in high demand. And then any fears about my ability to provide kind of goes away, because when I think about it, like in this evolutionary way, sort of, that's a wide open niche. And strangely, people aren't thinking about it that way.
Yeah. And the thing is that what it all comes down to, really, in my mind, is if you're blessed to live in a wealthy, industrialized society, or urbanish kind of place like the United States, or here in Australia or Europe or East Asia, lots of places in this world are very safe and they're very well looked after, very well to do. You can have kids and they're going to be okay. And so really what you want to know is, will this be a plus for me? Like, is this something I'm going to be good at? Do I want to dedicate myself to? Because, kids are relentless. You can't give them back. They don't say, oh, dad's not feeling well, I won't ask him for anything today. They just don't work like that. And so you want to jump into that fray if you think this is going to be something that suits me. But I think worrying about what's going to happen to your kids and will they live in a good world, that's not even a worry anymore. The world was so much rougher when I was born, and our parents didn't even think about that question. Your parents, what they did when they were born, their parents gave no thought to, are they going to make it? And the world is so much better now. Your kids are going to make it. They're going to be fine. The question is just like, do you want to do this?
Hmm. Well, there's that four cycle ancient Greek sort of dictum of like hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, weak men
Yep.
create bad times.
Yep.
So that's the part I worry about. If we're in the process of good times creating weak generation, that'll create bad times, but maybe AI will save us from
That
that.
that's possible. It's possible, but I do think that we don't need hard people anymore because we don't fight the elements anymore. All we want is to find ways to do better together. And so we defeated the elements. They're not a problem. Um, and we defeated predators. They're not a problem. The only real problem that we face is each other. And so, and that was often largely true even for the ancient Greeks, right? Their greatest threat was other humans. But but even that threat is so greatly lessened now. I mean, that's one of the lessons of Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, that violence has gone way, way down. And there's always going to be blips. Not a particularly good time right now, but it's I firmly believe it will continue to decline, because they're on average, we benefit by cooperating much more than we benefit by competing. It's
Hmm.
one of the great things about being human. And AI and all that's only going to make it more that way. People worry a lot about AI and aliens and all this stuff, and it's human nature to worry about these things. And probably
Hmm.
worry is a good idea. It helps you decide, devise fail-safe things. But I've only seen the world become relentlessly a better place with its own problems that we nonetheless continue to solve. When I was a little kid, Lake Erie used to catch on fire. The lake, that's how polluted it was. And so now, and they told us you won't be able to eat fish out of this lake for hundreds of generations. Well, you can already fish in Lake Erie and they're perfectly fine. And so,
Wow.
we're better at solving our problems and we should be more optimistic than we are. Things, they relentlessly work out well when we put our mind to it.
Yeah, a lot of people in my generation are pretty pessimistic. I mean, in general, but especially about issues like climate change. Maybe it's the evolutionary psychology education, but I tend to take a step back and think 60 years is like a blip, and we've done a lot in 60 years. So even to figure out that it's a problem in a few decades and to make steps, I mean, you can always do better, but I'm pretty amazed at the speed of this progress.
Yes, I am too. And there's, climate change it may be too late to stop it from tipping over to a certain point. It may be that people in low-lying cities and small islands are going to have to move. But we tend to think about that in the context of our own world that we're in right now and say, well, where will they go and who will want them? Right. Right now, people are shipping immigrants back to their home country. But trust me, when the world's population is starting to decline, and if it becomes warmer and suddenly all of northern Canada and all of northern Russia are free for agriculture, you're going to want people to move to those places. And so
Mhm.
instead of trying to keep immigrants out of your country, you're going to be setting up competitions to try to convince them to come to you. And so you're going to have people who want to move for climate reasons, and you're going to have people who want to welcome them to their country. And so I think that, a little ingenuity, which we always find, is going to solve this problem like it solved every other problem.
I'm thinking back to what you said earlier about luck, and I'm wondering how much of it is that and how much of it is this nostalgia bias or creating a post hoc story where things seem to line up, almost like a form of confirmation bias. I've done this a lot with myself, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing, by the way, because I think it gives people a lot of gratitude and sense of meaning. But when I think about, for example, how I came to this program and became interested in sex hormones and brain development, uh, there was a lot of luck just in that in a more abstract way. I first got interested in neuroscience through these philosophical questions about nature versus nurture, free will. Applied to join a neuroscience lab. It just so happened that it was focused on hormones and brain development, one of many potential topics. And then through that, well, it's just what I got interested in. And then you know how the academic system works. Like you apply to people more or less in the same area that aligns with your interests. You got letters of recommendation. So just the fact that my old advisor knew professors at Harvard, just the fact that they were taking students that year, like a lot of luck lined up. On the other hand, I probably would have ended up somewhere. And if I was somewhere else, I'd be telling the same story about the different lucky pieces that lined up there.
Yeah, I agree with you that on average, we tend to look back at our own random path and think how lucky was it that things ended up well. But it doesn't. it's also the case that it doesn't always end up well. And I know people who are crazy smart who made career choices that were the wrong ones. And then they end up doing jobs that don't really interest them, where they're not as successful as they could be in another field. And so they look back and they may be doing what we're doing, but I actually think they're not. I think they're going, I wish I hadn't done X. X has led me down a path that just hasn't been as successful. And so I think that when we look back and see luck, what we don't realize is lots of pathways would have been lucky. And so we would have felt that way in lots of alternate circumstances. But at the same time, there are a fair few dead ends for almost all of us. But we don't have, we're not so skilled with everything that we could do anything at all. And so you could find yourself like, I thought about pursuing engineering. And I now know that just doesn't suit me at all. I would have been mediocre, and B, I wouldn't have really liked it. But I could imagine a world where for whatever reason I did. And I'm sitting there in an engineering firm, don't really like my job that much. And I say, well, it's okay. The job isn't really great for me, but I make a good living and I get time with my family. So you try to make excuses for it, but you wouldn't be feeling lucky in the same way that you and I do today.
This is a good tie-in to talk about your recent career shift, which sounds like it's worked out really well for you working for Woop, this digital health company.
Yeah. So I left academics. Let's see, what is it? It's 25 now. At the end of 2023, I always telescope time. I'm not even positive it's true. It might have been the end of 2022. I think that is right. And so a couple of years ago, and I started working. I don't work for Woop, but I'm a contractor. I do contract research with them, but that's my main job. That's my full week is spent working with them, and it's such a great job. It's like the sort of dream job for scientists because they've got enormous amounts of data. And so when you want to ask a question, you don't build a sample of 50 people, you build a sample of 10,000 or 100,000 people. And they've also got a huge scope of questions that they could ask. And so often they'll say, oh, we want to survey our members about X. Is there anything you'd like to know? And then that gives you a chance to explore all sorts of interesting questions. So it's a little bit, as a social scientist who's very interested in the link between psychology and biology, it's a little bit like being this kid in the candy shop where you got a million questions you can ask and tons and tons of data and colleagues who are fun and interested and supportive as you dive into that. So yeah, I left academics and I've now been working with them for a few years.
Are you able to talk about some of the specific questions that you get to research?
Mhm. Sure. So, most of what we're interested in surrounds issues of sleep and exercise, but of course, lots and lots of things tie into sleep and exercise. And so, for example, um, we have a paper that's just now in press at the Journal of Motion. So it's a psychology paper where we're looking at, we asked people when they went to bed at night and when they woke up in the morning, when they woke up, we asked if they anticipated their day being either threatening or challenging or both. And by threat, I mean something you're going to face some sort of barrier that you probably will fail at, that you probably can't overcome. And by challenge, I mean you'll face some sort of barrier that you probably can overcome, that you'll probably succeed at it. And so we asked about their day coming up and about their day at the end of the day. And it turns out that didn't matter that much for this particular question. But what we found was that when you're facing a threat or a challenge, your average heart rate goes up over the course of the day. And we can measure it very accurately. So it'd be less than a beat a minute, but we can see that. But interestingly, when you anticipate a threat or challenge before you go to bed at night, coming up the next day, now your heart rate accelerates if it's threat, but it decelerates if it's challenge. And that's really nice because what you want when you go to sleep is parasympathetic dominance. You want your system to slow down. And so having a decelerating heart rate helps you sleep more soundly, more restoratively. And so what it looks like is that your body actually prepares for challenge by sleeping better. But when it's something that's threatening, it's just too overwhelming. It's too stressful. You can't do that. And so you actually sleep slightly worse. Your resting heart rate goes up. And so, they came to me and they're like, look, we're going to put out the survey. And so our team met together and we said, well, what would we really like to know? And this is one of several questions that we asked. And then you can plunk it in. And then a few weeks later, 10,000 people have given you daily you've got heart rate on them for weeks and you've got answers to these questions and you know what their days are like. And you can just answer questions in ways that just super hard to do as a regular academic.
There's such an interesting subculture building around Whoop and Huberman. I've got a friend who works in a neuroscience lab at Mass Gen, and he's just all in on this type of health obsession. So he has a Whoop. He's tracking his sleep every day, tracking his macros, tracking everything. Got a continuous glucose monitor for blood
Uh-huh.
sugar. Like does the red light therapy at night, the ice bath plunges. Like people build their whole lives around around it. It's really interesting for me to watch as an outsider.
It is super cool. And it's also, it's what's really nice about it is that it's not just the case that we learn new things that apply to everybody, but it's also the case that we learn when you start to get into digital health, you learn what applies to you. And so I too put on a glucose monitor as part of our research projects as well. And I too, of course, wear a Whoop. And I saw that, for example, some foods that I eat create a big glucose spike in me that they don't create such a big spike in other people. And some foods I eat don't create much of a spike. And so sometimes it's very idiosyncratic, but sometimes I realized rules that apply to me in ways that I didn't think they did. So for example, if I eat Rice Krispies versus cornflakes, I get a much bigger glucose spike because of course the rice flour turns into glucose much more rapidly than the corn flour does. I think that's widely known, but it wasn't widely known by me. And so eating Rice Krispies was like eating a candy bar compared to eating a bowl of cornflakes in the morning. And so you learn things about both in general and about yourself that are really important. And so we have this at Whoop, we have this journal where you can test ideas like, I wonder what happens to my sleep if I drink red wine. I wonder what happens to my sleep if I have CBD. And then you have it some days, you don't have it others, and you can look at these within person effects. And what we see when we step back and look at thousands of people's data is that some things that help one person actually harm another. So CBD in general helps people sleep, but some people it helps a lot. Some people it helps not at all. And some people it actually disrupts their sleep a little bit. So the nice thing about these things is you don't need to rely on overall standard rules. You don't need to say, oh, this is overall helpful. You can say, how much does it help me? And that's where your friends ice bathing and glucose monitoring and Whoop and all those things, they come together really nicely if you're keen to say, how can I maximize my performance? How can I maximize my health?
Have you noticed since paying attention to your own data on your sleep patterns or blood sugar, things like that, and then making whatever interventions, has it actually impacted your mental health?
Well, I I have this very genetically
You have
robust
good mental health
high level of
anyway, so it's
happiness.
hard
Yeah,
to, yeah.
I roll along very content, and so it's that doesn't change. But you know, the what I am trying to do is I'm a really keen rock climber, and I don't go climb outdoors that much at cliffs because it takes so much. I love it, but it takes a lot of time. Like that's a day's adventure rather than going to the gym for an hour and a half. So I love to climb at these bouldering gyms. And I know that I'm basically one bad accident or whatever away from never having to end my climbing career because I'm 61 years old. And so I'm trying to, but I love doing it. I'm trying to make it last as long as I possibly can. And so I'm paying a lot more attention to what's my sleep and recovery like, how hard can I train today? Because I know that if I make a mistake and I overdo it and injure myself, which is, injury is lots of causes of injury, but one cause is overdoing it. That's a very common cause. And so I'm more careful not to overdo it now because I won't bounce back like I would when I was 20. And it took me, 10 years to build up the strength to be able to do it. And I know I'd lose that strength in 10 weeks if I were immobilized, and that would be it for my rock climbing career. So if you want to fight, Mother Nature, which we always lose in the end, but if you want to sustain activities beyond where you typically could, then these kinds of devices are really helpful.
What about psychologically? Roy Baumeister talks about ego depletion, like that you can push yourself too hard cognitively, inhibitory control wise, and then basically you burn out and you have to wait a while to recharge. But people talk about burnout. I don't know of the empirical literature on it. Like, do you think that's what actually happens? There's such a thing as overexerting yourself, as opposed to more like it's like a muscle. The more you push yourself, you get used to it so long as you do it incrementally.
I suspect that both are true, that you can build up self-control or inhibitory control or whatever, your mental reserves over time, but you also can overdo it. Um, I work with, in my job, we collaborate with people all over the country, lots of academics and lots of practitioners. And I work with a team of emergency medical care physicians and we're publishing a series of papers out of the data we've collected, where we're looking at burnout. And one of the things that we find is, they love their job. They love going into the ER and taking somebody who's had a bad accident or been shot or whatever and putting them back together and saving their life. This is, as you could imagine, it's immensely rewarding, but it's also really burning out to be doing this 24/7, and especially to be working nights. And so we find that there are ways. For example, we just published a paper where these surgeons have to work nights because, car accidents don't only happen during the day. People, in fact, are more likely to shoot and stab each other at night than they are during the day. And so somebody has to be in the emergency room at night as well. And so they all take turns. And we find, for example, that it's more burning out. Each episode of call that they have to do when they're up all night doing surgery has a bigger impact on their burnout if the culture in which they work doesn't do a good job of taking that into account. And so some cultures, some hospitals say, oh, once you've done call, somebody else will do your rounds. We'll do everything we can to allow you to rebound and get a nice night's sleep and maybe go out and exercise and spend some time with your family, whatever, to come back from it. And others are like, go back to work. And the go back to work cultures it's burnout levels per episode of call are higher. Like if I have to take call, it has a more negative impact on me in a culture like that than in a culture that accommodates me. So you can start to see, that you can overdo it. You can overfry yourself by expecting to be up all night and then be up all day. And there are ways that we can step in and mitigate this.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. It reminds me of the daylight savings effects. Have you heard about this? Where when people gain an hour of sleep at a population level, like car accidents are down, heart attacks are down, just all these little things. And then when they lose an hour of sleep, the opposite happens.
Yeah. And these daylight savings effects are real. They're small, but they're very real, and you can see them at a population level. And of course, it's got people asking, is it worth even switching? Right? It's nice to have people do better on the one day, but it's not so nice to have them do worse on the other. And so, these little tiny things matter. And that's, again, it comes back to the stuff with Woop. Like that's one of the nice things about the device is you can keep track of it. Now, another fun thing about the research is that we find things that we weren't even necessarily looking for. There's so much data that we find this wild serendipitous stuff. And so for example, this is not something I was looking for. I was running some analyses and I started to find that if you do something good, like that's good for your health, you benefit more from it on days that you exercise. Now, let me caveat this by saying, I don't even know for sure that this is true yet because it hasn't passed peer review. It's just data we have in the can. But I find that, for example, if you wear blue light blocking glasses before you go to bed, that always helps you sleep better because it allows your melatonin release because you're blocking the blue light that's coming from all of our electric lights, and it's a more natural way to go to sleep. But I find but when we analyze those data, we see that blue light blocking glasses work better if you've already exercised a lot that day compared to if you haven't. I have no idea why that should be. The same thing with seeing the morning sun and the first thing when you get up, it tends to set your circadian clock, but it has a bigger effect if you then subsequently exercise that day than if you don't. So there's lots of funky things about the way our body works, and there's fun things that we can see in the data that, our samples are so big, we know it's real. I just might be making a mistake and not accounting for something I should be accounting for.
So there's already a separate main effect. Sorry.
Yeah. So you're right. There's a separate main effect for whatever the good thing is. And then it's moderated by exercise, that it gets better for you if you exercise at the same time. Now, previously I thought that bad things also get worse for you. I'm no longer sure that's true. So it looked like originally that maybe alcohol is worse for you if you also drink on days you exercise. Further analyses suggest that may not be the case. That you may actually drink more on days that you exercise. And so when you do it at drink per drink level, that effect pretty much disappears. So I don't yet, again, we're still exploring it. But my point here is just that, so you can't take any of these findings to the bank yet, but what is nice is that this is it's one of the great things about academics, right? You just explore data, you get something interesting, maybe you didn't even expect to find, and then you can take a deep dive into it and try to make sense out of it.
And that's additive on top of the benefits you'd already get from exercising.
Yes. Yeah. So you got benefits of exercise, you got benefits in behavior, and then the behavior has a bigger impact on days you exercise independent of what your exercise does to you. Yeah. So I don't yet know if it's even true or what it means, but my point is just that it's, I believe it so far. The data suggests that this is the case. And then the question that we're going to explore more before we try to do anything with it is, well, what exactly is the cause of this? How could that, what is exercise doing that makes a blue light blocking glasses or time restricted eating or morning sun more effective?
Hmm. I'm thinking about all this in the context of you writing your second book, because I mean, after doing 100 plus of these interviews, it's kind of normal to, talking to academics who've written a book, except it's not normal at all. Most people never do it. So it's
Yeah.
fascinating. And it's also it makes more sense to me that academics are doing it, because I guess it's part of their job. It's even more fascinating to me when now in this case you have another full-time job and you still write the book.
Yeah.
And then also
Yeah.
in
I
the
love,
context of this ego depletion stuff, like where does the extra
yeah.
energy come from?
Yeah. The thing is that, there's only so many hours in the day and you don't want to sacrifice your relationships and your connections in order to do these things like write books and do work. But it's writing books is a little bit like podcasting. Here you are, a busy grad student. You've got your own research you ought to be doing, and yet you constantly talking to people about what they're up to and reading their work and stuff. Because part of our job, part of what attracts to us to these jobs is this idea about telling the world about it and about sharing it, right? And so, we're all drawn to that in one form or another. Storytelling is fundamental to our existence as humans. It's part of what separates us from. It's part of what makes us cultural animals. Is that we pass on these stories, and they could be podcasts, they could be books, they could be articles, but books have the advantage that they reach people that articles don't, and podcasts have the advantage that they reach people that articles don't. And so it's hard to give them up. It's hard to not do them.
Hmm. That's a great place to close. Thank you for your time, Bill. It's great to catch up with you.
Yeah, it's great to catch up again. I look forward to our next one.